Today, we're unraveling the story of an American leader whose totally unexpected political stances literally almost ignited the Civil War a full decade early. We are talking about the 12th President of the United States, Zachary Taylor. His story is just this stunning example of how someone's personal background and their public political actions can completely collide, leaving a massive, highly complicated mark on American history.
So let's dive right into this historical mystery. Think about this. If someone asked you which early American president who was a wealthy slave owner himself actively threatened to personally hang Southern secessionists who wanted to expand slavery, well, you'd probably be stumped, right? It's a massive contradiction. How in the world does a man whose private life relies on an institution become the exact person ready to lead an army against its expansion? To figure out this paradox, we really need to look closely at the man they called Old Rough and Ready.
Section 1. Rise of a Military Hero, from Plantation to the Battlefield. Born in Virginia in 1784, Taylor actually grew up on a Kentucky plantation called Springfield, and he knew from a super young age that he wanted to be in the military, eventually enlisting at 22. Now, for the next 25 years, Taylor basically spent his life as this rugged officer, policing the nation's borderlands, fighting campaigns, and serving at garrison posts. But the real turning point? That came in 1847 during the Mexican-American War. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Taylor defeated General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna at the Battle of Buena Vista. I mean, this massive underdog victory completely cemented his status as a national military hero. And, as you'll see, it perfectly prepared him for the American political stage. But here is a really startling number to keep in the back of your mind. Hundreds. Because right alongside that celebrated military career we just talked about, Zachary Taylor was building a vast personal enterprise. He owned and operated plantations in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Rodney, Mississippi. Hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children labored at these properties just to sustain the large Taylor family. And honestly, this is the very foundation of our paradox today. You've got a fierce nationalist military hero who was simultaneously deeply entrenched in the Southern plantation economy.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the 1848 election, the blank slate candidate.
So the Whig Party, hoping to kind of replicate their past successes, actually turned away from their own party leader, Henry Clay, and decided to nominate Taylor. Why? Well, mainly because Taylor was a total political outsider who had basically avoided taking any controversial stances. He was a blank slate. This allowed different regions of the country to project exactly what they wanted onto him. Northerners looked at him and thought, okay, here's a military leader, an avowed nationalist who will keep the country together. Meanwhile, Southerners looked at him and saw a wealthy slave owner who would absolutely protect their economic interests. He was, quite literally, everything to everyone. And the 1848 race was chaotic, to say the least. Taylor faced off against Democratic candidate Lewis Cass, who was pushing this idea of allowing territories to self-determine if they'd support slavery. But the real twist came from the newly formed Free Soil Party, who fiercely opposed the expansion of slavery into any new territories. They nominated former President Martin Van Buren. Now, Van Buren obviously didn't win, but he managed to siphon off just enough votes from anti-slavery Democrats to completely tank Cass's chances, and that effectively handed the presidency straight to Zachary Taylor.
Section 3. The Presidential Paradox, Personal Actions versus Political Goals.
Once Taylor actually got into office, the nation was already fiercely divided over whether the new Western lands should be open to slavery. Yet, in his private life, Taylor didn't change his ways at all upon moving to Washington. He remained a slave owner for his entire life, managing his Cypress Grove plantation from afar. More than that, President Taylor was surrounded by enslaved valets, cooks, and maids right inside the executive mansion. Our source documents actually give us the names of some of the enslaved individuals who likely served at the White House: Charles Porter, Tom, Dicey, Jane, William, and Caroline. Knowing their names really grounds this history in reality, right? It shows us that Taylor's daily life was just incredibly reliant on enslaved labor. So here is the absolutely crucial point, the massive contradiction at the heart of his presidency. Despite his heavy personal reliance on enslaved people, Taylor's political policy was the exact opposite of what Southern leaders expected. While he tried to remain above the general political fray, Taylor personally did not support the expansion of slavery into the new Western territories. It's wild. His political goals and his private actions were completely clashing.
Actually, Taylor was so completely unsatisfied with the debates and ideas coming out of Congress that he devised his own bold, really straightforward plan. Step 1, bypass the territorial stage entirely. Just skip it. Step 2, urged settlers in New Mexico and California to directly draft their own constitutions and immediately apply for statehood as free states. He essentially wanted to completely shut down the slavery expansion debate before it could even get off the ground in Congress.
Which brings us to Section 4, the looming crisis, threats of secession. As you can imagine, Taylor's anti-expansion maneuver enraged Southern leaders. It brought the nation to a boiling point, with genuine, real threats of secession. But this brilliantly illustrates his ruthless resolve as a nationalist first and foremost. In February 1850, Taylor held a conference with the very Southern leaders who were threatening secession, and he didn't back down an inch. He looked them in the eye and told them that if it was necessary to enforce the laws, he would personally lead the army. He flat out stated that persons taken in rebellion against the Union, he would hang with less reluctance than he had hanged deserters and spies in Mexico. Think about that. This was no empty political rhetoric. This was a seasoned, battle-hardened general promising war against his own political base just to preserve the nation.
Section 5, a sudden end, July 1850. So the nation was on a knife's edge. But while the debate over territories and secession continued to just embroil officials and citizens alike, Taylor went about his regular duties. On the 4th of July, 1850, the president participated in ceremonies at the Washington Monument. But shortly after the event, Taylor became violently, severely sick. Just 5 days later, on July 9, 1850, President Zachary Taylor died of a gastrointestinal illness right there in the White House. Just like that, the uncompromising general who was fully ready to march on the South was gone.
And his sudden death completely turned the political landscape upside down. With the stubborn, anti-expansion president out of the picture, the warring factions in Congress frantically labored to piece together a grand compromise. Ultimately, the forces of compromise triumphed over the immediate threat of secession, effectively putting a giant legislative band-aid on a deeply, deeply fractured nation. But that grand compromise, it only bought the country exactly 11 years. It merely delayed the inevitable. The very war that Zachary Taylor had been fully willing, even eager to fight in 1850, finally erupted 11 years later, tearing the nation apart. Which leaves us with this final, truly striking thought to ponder. The main takeaway here is really about how deeply fragile historical timelines actually are. If a sudden stomach bug hadn't stopped Zachary Taylor in 1850, would an earlier conflict led by a fierce slave-owning Unionist general have been shorter? Would it have permanently altered the entire course of American history and the timeline of emancipation? It's a fascinating what-if that proves, for sure, that truth is often much stranger and much more paradoxical than fiction. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive today, and keep questioning the history you think you know.